Chicago Overcoat is a 2009 mob movie directed by Brian Caunter and which stars Frank Vincent in the lead role as an aged mafia hitman and enforcer. I've always liked Frank Vincent. He's a household name among mob movie fanatics, what with his small but effective roles in Scorsese films like Goodfellas and Casino. He was wonderful as the primary antagonist in the latter stages of The Sopranos, and has popped up here and there in small parts in films like Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. I honestly believe, had he not died by the time they got around to filming, Vincent would have been a part of Martin Scorsese's gangster movie reunion film, The Irishman, in which the likes of Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci starred in. Pesci and Vincent had been in the same Scorsese films at that point, and the duo even put food on the table by being a comedy duo act before their movie days. Vincent was very much part of the Scorsese mob movie family, and it's such a shame that he missed out on the big finale. I thought he would be perfect for the role of Tony Pro in the film. Everything about him, from the way he looks to his acting ability, would make him fit like a glove for the part. So with Vincent having passed before Scorsese's last gangster film got made, I chanced upon this movie made 10 years prior, one of the very last mob movies with Vincent, perhaps the last with him in a prominent role. The starring role, no less, and funnily enough, given the plot of The Irishman, playing an aged mob hitman past his prime, coming to terms with his life as the world moves on without him. Lou Marazano, Vincent's character, is in his 60s and yet never made the rank of captain in his crew. He's at a senior age where he can reflect on the fact that he hasn't exactly been the best of fathers to his daughter due to his gangster lifestyle, so seeks to make amends by connecting with his grandson, whose father, also a mobster, is absent in his life as he'd rather spend time at strip clubs with girls around his shoulders and snorting coke instead of spending time with his wife and son. Lou finds difficulty in setting his son-in-law straight as the guy sees little reason in respecting a man who's at retirement age and yet could never make it to captain. To make some extra cash, and perhaps to prove a point, seeing as though his fellow mobsters see him as a dinosaur, Lou asks for and gets a contract of hits on 3 different stool pigeons who are going to testify in court against a mob boss who's already in prison, and risks having his sentence go into double figures if the witnesses aren't taken out. Lou's signature calling card is to leave a bunch of flowers to the widow of the victims he kills. An old detective called Ralph Maloney, played very lively and entertainingly by Danny Goldring, catches wind of this calling card and has to prove that Maranzano has come out of retirement after 30 years. So the chase is on, with Vincent going around doing the hits and the cops on his tail sniffing for leads. Eventually, Lou gets arrested and questioned, and the mob gets cold feet and orders a hit on him as they want to take no chances that Lou himself flips, and so Marazano ends up having to fight both the cops and the mob who he worked with for decades. That last bit is actually one of the dumbest things about the film, as Lou was known for being a stand-up guy and the cops literally had him questioned for a short while and are forced to let him go due to a lack of evidence. It all seemed very routine, and it was quite bizarre and alarming to see that the mobsters decided to randomly whack Lou, as if the film director realized he only had enough story at that point for an hour worth of film and had to pad it out a bit. And really, if you think too hard about it, the story falls apart in many ways, and I found myself questioning the main character's motivation to begin with. So he's not done a hit for 30 years, and now wants to reconnect with his daughter and grandson. So why now all of a sudden does he want to get back in the game? Surely it should be the opposite, and he wants to retire from the mob completely, as suggested when he gives an anti-violence talk to his grandson over Sundays, which, by the way, is hilariously reminiscent of a scene in The Sopranos where Frank Vincent's character Phil Leotardo scolds his nephew. I was half expecting Lou to call the kid a Puerto Rican whore. Anyway, Chicago Overcoat belongs in a milieu of films that exploded since the turn of the century. These are pretty much low-budget, direct-to-DVD mob flicks that most people haven't heard of and even less enjoy. They usually star bit players who popped up with a few lines of dialogue in Goodfellas or The Sopranos, and often range from mediocre and boring, like Gotti with John Travolta in 2018, to downright laughably bad, like Mobtown, both of which I have reviewed on the channel if you're interested. Now, for what it is, Chicago Overcoat isn't really that bad. Of course, it isn't in the same universe of films like Goodfellas, but all things considered, I did come away from the film enjoying myself, even though there was heaps of room for improvement. If anything, the movie provides a nice little send-off for Frank Vincent. For fans of this kind of low-budget, made-for-TV feel mafia flick, you'll know that you often see the same faces doing revolver door-like appearances in these films. This one actually has a really good cast, considering the $2 million budget, but you'll be frustrated to hear that some of the big names, like Mike Starr, Stacy Keach, and Armand Assante, who played John Gotti in the HBO Gotti movie back in the 90s, are hardly in it. Keach was in it for literally 30 seconds and I can't even remember why. There was one or two other notable names, like Kathrine Narducci, who has a sizable role as the lead romantic interest. The rest of the cast is pretty much shit. In a way, the teasing amount of screen time for these guys works in the film's favour, because at the end of the day they are all playing cardboard cutout characters, and the only person in the film with a hint of development is Frank Vincent's aged enforcer. The movie is something of a character study, and there's enough meat for Vincent to chew on for him to be effective and give a good performance, playing a legitimately interesting character, even if at times he looks like he'll shatter into pieces if someone touches him. I know he's supposed to be old in the film, but some cutaway action shots were quite obvious, and the way Frank Vincent moved and apparently intimidated guys half his age was a little cringeworthy. It made De Niro's curb stomp in The Irishman make him look like an Olympic athlete. The film is a little muddled with what it wants to do. Sometimes it wants to be a conspiracy movie, sometimes a shoot-'em-up, sometimes a mob movie, and sometimes a character study. Throwing all of these things in a blender has bizarre consequences, like one part where Frank Vincent is almost doing a puppy dog face when he's initially dismissed after being rejected to do a hit. It's pretty weird that the film wants us to get sad and emotional at a scene of a guy not being allowed to perform a serial killing. The film can be summarized as following an old guy running around killing people and trying to recapture his glory days. By the way, I don't even know what glory days these guys were referring to in the film, because Lou talks about the 1980s a lot, and yet he has a Tommy gun on his wall that he used to use. And surely people weren't walking around with Tommy guns in the 80s, that would be the 20s and 30s. Weirdly, the movie is quite boring as a mob drama for about an hour. The end is actually the best part, when the movie goes all Get Carter and Frank Vincent goes rogue and starts blowing people away left, right and centre. The action scenes were great. There were some great blood effects and real muzzle flash and brutal sound effects of guns firing and cocking. For much of its runtime, the movie has Frank Vincent go about his business and narrate to us things past, present and future in flowery, creative dialogue. It's clearly trying to replicate the noir films of the 1940s. It even has the trumpet score to go along with it. But it doesn't really work, and comes off as a cheap, subpar effort, not least because the narration from Vincent sounds forced and a lot more convoluted than the way the character actually talks. A lot of the time the dialogue is chalkboard cringe, and you actually kind of picture Vincent sitting there reading the lines of a script into the microphone. As mentioned, it's actually when the movie drops all pretense of a mafia movie, when it stops trying to be a budget Goodfellas, is actually when it gets entertaining, because then you don't mind the cheesy dialogue and the cliches, and can just enjoy it as a fun, dumb action flick. I've seen worse films than this, and it's worth watching if you're bored, or if you want to see Frank Vincent in an overcoat and fedora blowing people away with a Tommy gun, which was as awesome as it sounds. Other than that, it's a middling crime flick that you'll forget you've seen a few days after you watch it. I give it a 6 out of 10.